Grace United Church in Wellsville, New York. This week we are holding our worship service in our church's mission center. Grace United was formed a few years ago by the joining together of the congregation of First Congregational Church, where we meet for worship regularly, and the Christian Temple, where we are meeting for service today. Currently, this building houses a number of community services and ministries. This Sunday, it's a very exciting day. It's Pentecost Sunday, the day that we remember when the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus' followers. It happened after Jesus went back up to heaven. These followers were waiting. Acts chapter 2, verse 2 tells us, "When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them." These followers told Jesus' story in many, many different languages. And that day, 2,000 people chose to follow Christ, to live their lives according to Jesus' teachings. On Pentecost Sunday, we celebrate the birth of the Christian church. It's the day that the church spread like wildfire to be Jesus' hands and feet in the world. Over the millennia, and even until today, there have been challenges. People in the church, and even leaders, who don't reflect the love or the teachings of Jesus. But nevertheless, we celebrate. We celebrate that after 2,000 years, the story continues and lives are changed. And we are a part of that story. Here in Wellsville, we're celebrating the birth of the church, and we're also celebrating the birth of our church, of Grace United Church. In June of 2016, members of the Christian Temple covenanted with members of First Congregational Church, and they founded Grace United Church. Both congregations had strong histories in the community, histories that included vibrant worship, community ministry, biblical teaching, and ecumenical efforts. In the joys and the sorrows, the challenges of life, they prayed and they worked together. Both of these churches were affiliated with wonderful denominations who have for 2 centuries faithfully worshiped God and served others. Birthdays are special. They are a time of celebration of what has been and what is to come. Now in our family, there's often a lot of singing with birthdays. When our girls were growing up, we would begin their birthday, their special day, by carrying a breakfast tray to their room and singing to them. And of course, later in the day, there would be singing before the blowing out of the candles on their birthday cake. And then later in the day, they may very likely get some telephone calls. You see, on our birthdays, the birthday person gets several phone calls from any number of family members, including aunts and uncles or grandparents, who sing happy birthday to them. Speaking of singing, one thing you may not know about the song Happy Birthday to You is maybe you wonder who composed it. Who might you guess it was? And when do you think that it was composed? Any guesses? It has a rather interesting story. Mildred Hill and her sister Patty published the tune in 1893. They were kindergarten teachers in Kentucky. Originally, the song had different lyrics. It was titled, "Good Morning to All." The sisters intended it as a cheery way to start the school day. It went like this: "Good morning to you, good morning to you, good morning, dear children, good morning to all." A few decades later, early in the 20th century, someone thought up the happy birthday version, and it became an instant classic. Until 2015, the song was under copyright. The copyright holder was Warner Chappell Music. It bought the rights from the original publisher. Warner Chappell knew that it had a cash cow. People had to pay royalties to sing the song. And here's where it gets interesting. The company also knew that the royalties wouldn't last forever, so when the Good Morning to all copyright finally expired, Warner Chappell renewed it based on the date of Happy Birthday to You, and when that was copyrighted, which was 1935. It was a clever legal move. They reset the copyright expiration clock for a few more years, and it enabled Warner Chappell to keep on collecting royalties from anyone who used the song in a commercial setting. This included film studios, radio and television stations, other music companies, and restaurants. Yes, restaurants. Maybe you had wondered why staff in chain restaurants never sang the Happy Birthday song. Instead, they'd clap their hands to this rhyming ditty. This is because they didn't have the rights to the Happy Birthday song. Legally, Warner Chappell would have been eager to accept a hefty annual licensing fee from any of these big restaurant chains if their workers sang the Happy Birthday song. And they would charge the chain for each of their locations. And so, to avoid these fees, the restaurant franchises bailed out of the Happy Birthday song, and they came up with their own birthday songs instead. It's kind of sad, isn't it? So there was a movement to return the song to the public domain. It happened a few years ago, and guess what? The people prevailed. The music company's sweetheart deal abruptly ended on September 22nd, 2015. That's when Judge George H. King of the U.S. District Court in Los Angeles invalidated its copyright filing. He considered the two songs different. He said Warner Chappell should never have been permitted to transfer its expiring copyright of Good Morning to All to the newer birthday version. Since then, the Happy Birthday song belongs to everyone. It's now in the public domain. Pentecost is the day the Church of Jesus Christ entered the public domain. Today, we can also say to the church, Happy Birthday to you! Until Jesus' little band of disciples experienced the descending dove and the tongues of fire and the babble of ecstatic voices, they were not quite ready for prime time. In a way, we could say that their faith was proprietary and private. But after those remarkable events, their old song suddenly became new. Pentecost is the third biggest celebration of the Christian year, but it runs far behind Christmas and Easter in popularity. In the case of the other two holidays, secular culture has embraced the religious feast knockoffs. There is secular Christmas with its blatant consumerism and vague ethic of doing something nice for someone you already love. And as for secular Easter, it's a celebration of a rite of spring. No one has trouble finding decorations and greeting cards for secular Christmas or secular Easter. Many of them feature familiar mascots of the holidays, Santa and the Easter Bunny. These symbolic figures have high name recognition, even among people who've never entered a church or know nothing about Jesus. Certain things you might never ever see in relationship to Pentecost are maybe Pentecost cards in a drugstore? Or have you ever savored a special candy that has that kind of commemorates this holiday, Pentecost? Have you ever baked Pentecost cookies? Well, I guess someone thought of it, but they're certainly not as popular as Christmas cookies. Here's another question. I wonder, do you think the church will ever issue a call to keep the Holy Spirit in Pentecost? It's not very likely. It's not a problem. Nobody's trying to hijack the rights to this holiday. Pentecost is ours alone. It belongs to the church. It's quite an amazing story. The Pentecost miracle could easily not have happened at all. After Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, the disciples scattered in fear. They took off. The disciples fled, but they didn't go far. The good news of Easter gathered them once again. They enjoyed a few brief weeks of wonder in the presence of this resurrected Jesus. But after the ascension, what next? That experience could have been it. It could have been a satisfying bookend to their years of wandering in the countryside. I wonder, who would have blamed them if they'd simply turned around and returned to their homes after all of that? If it wasn't for the miracle of Pentecost, the church might never have come to be. Do you remember J.R.R. Tolkien's book, The Hobbit? Well, the disciples could have been like the Hobbit who returned home, like Bilbo Baggins, how he returned home at the conclusion of the story. It was said that he returned home to savor the spread of second breakfasts in good Hobbit fashion and to spin his stories, his remarkable adventure yarn, talking until his neighbors grew tired of hearing him. Now, had the disciples just returned to their homes to tell their stories, the gospel message would have remained isolated and irrelevant. It would have been a quirky tale that meant a great deal to them, but would have had little impact on anyone else. But that's not what happened, is it? They told the story of Jesus, sharing it in many languages, transforming lives. Jesus had said that his kingdom was not of this world. He didn't come to overthrow a political power. He came to change lives, to show people that through living sacrificially and loving, the world can be changed. The message of his teachings, his love, and his sacrifice have been faithfully conveyed over 2 millennia. After the roaring wind and the tongues of fire, everything was different. The disciples have become apostles. Their story belongs to the world. And we all know what happened next. They told the story and it spread like wildfire. It's quite amazing, isn't it, to think that over 2,000 years later, we are still telling the story. We are still sharing the message. Birthdays are a great time to reflect on the past, to think about where we have been and what has been accomplished. They're also a time to remember the people that made contributions to our lives, and those that carried us or those who carried our church forward. Birthdays are a time to reflect on the past. And birthdays also are a time to look forward, to consider what lies before us. In our lives and in our church, on our birthday, we hope and pray for good things to come. We ask God to help us to be faithful to God in all of the things that we do in the upcoming year. We hope and pray for meaningful relationships and life-giving work and activities. As a church, we anticipate growth in our spiritual formation and in our outreach efforts. Just like the first disciples, we have been given an important message and mission. It has been passed down to us by believers through the centuries, and now it is our responsibility to carry it forward. Each of us have our own faith stories based on our own spiritual experiences. For many of us, the subject of our relationship with God seems intensely private. We may continue to imagine that it is, but after Pentecost, it can never be that way. The work of the Holy Spirit is to loose God's people on the world to witness to the good news. We are to pass the news along. We aren't meant to keep our stories to ourselves, to hum our hymns under our breath. The resounding strains of Christian praise are meant to echo off the walls of cities and towns, large and small, on 6 continents. Theologian Emil Brunner famously said, "The church exists by mission, just as a fire exists by burning. Where there is no mission, there is no church. And where there is neither church nor mission, there is no faith." Sueli Gajewski understood this. She was the wife of David Gajewski, one of our United Church of Christ conference ministers. She passed away just a little over a week ago, at the end of May. This week, the conference sent a memorial note detailing her life's work. It described the events of her life and it shared her passions. It told of how she was born in Brazil, and after college, she served as a missionary in an impoverished area in northwest Brazil. It told of her mission trips to many places around the world, including the Honduras and Nicaragua. After marrying David, she moved to the United States and served in several churches. She routinely took suburban youth to the inner city to connect with the youth there. And she even had connections in Berlin, Germany, where she had a routine of serving in a soup kitchen while she visited there. Her personal motto was, "It's all about mission." She expanded church programs to serve low-income community folks in Syracuse. Her passion was to plan and to lead youth and adults in cultural immersion programs in Nicaragua. From a young age, she understood the purpose of the church It is to share God's love wherever she could, and she certainly lived it out. She had a wonderful spirit of generosity. Such a spirit can change the world now and for generations to come. Our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors, Jonas Salk once said. You're probably familiar with his name. Jonas Salk invented the first vaccine for polio. It was released in 1955. Until that time, polio had been a dreaded scourge. It struck down children and teenagers and young adults at the prime of their lives. Some survivors spent the rest of their lives lying on their backs in iron lungs, these crude respiratory machines that did their breathing for them. Others, like President Franklin D. Roosevelt, lost forever his ability to walk. But then came Dr. Salk with his miraculous vaccine. It was cheap and easy to produce, and it was so effective that it promised to rid the world of polio, which it soon did. Isn't this an adorable picture with this boy getting his vaccine in his bow tie and the nurse wearing her uniform? It was during this first rush of enthusiasm for the new treatment that Edward R. Murrow, the famed TV journalist, interviewed Salk. He asked him, who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well, the people, I would say, replied Dr. Salk. There's no patent. Could you patent the sun? You see, Dr. Salk could have been a very rich person had he successfully applied for a patent on his vaccine, but he decided not to. Now, some people claim that such an application would have been inadmissible on legal grounds, but even so, Salk never attempted it. A patent would have slowed down the production. It would have hiked the medicine's price out of reach for some of the poorest people. And it would have meant that more young people would have died of the disease or possibly been permanently paralyzed. Could you patent the sun? We can't do that any more than we can confine the good news of Jesus. The apostles realized this in a powerful way on that day of Pentecost. They raised their voices to share the good news. This is your mission, should you choose to accept it. The question is, will we accept the mission? The message of Jesus has been carried forward to us. Now it is ours to share. It's all about mission, Sueli reminds us. Our job is to share the story, the same story that transformed people's lives in Jerusalem, the same story that spread around the world, the story that inspired members of our congregation years ago, the story that has changed our lives, and if we are faithful to the task, the story that will impact generations to come. There is no better holiday to look to the future than Pentecost. So today, let's celebrate not only where we have been, but where we are to go. Happy birthday, church.